A hard winter dawn settles over a quiet stretch outside Duluth, Minnesota. Frost biting through broken fence lines, wind scraping across a house that should have been empty years ago. A 40-year-old veteran pulls into the drive with nothing but his aging K-9 partner beside him, planning to sell the place and leave the past buried. But on his very first night back, the dog stops cold at the barn, refusing to move, refusing to stand down, alerting him that someone is hiding where no one should be. One small decision to open that door will set off a chain of events that threatens his land, his future, and the fragile peace he fought so hard to reclaim. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Duluth, Minnesota didn't greet you like a postcard. It greeted you like a test. The city sat hard against Lake Superior, built of brick, iron, and stubbornness, and in late winter it looked as if the cold had taken a chisel to everything human and left only what could endure. Wind came off the lake in long, cutting sheets, carrying the smell of wet stone and old salt, and something metallic that tasted like coming snow. The harbor cranes stood like bent ribs against a low gray sky. Along the hillside streets, plows had packed the snow into walls that turned intersections into narrow corridors. Even at noon, the light felt thin, as if the sun didn't want to promise too much. Cal Rourke drove in with both hands fixed on the wheel, knuckles pale, posture straight out of habit rather than pride. He was 40. Broad-shouldered in a way that suggested old strength maintained by necessity, not gym vanity. His hair was cut close, a dark brown that showed more gray at the temples than he liked, and there was a faint scar along his right eyebrow, small but permanent, like a sentence that never quite ended. He kept his face clean-shaven most days, not because he cared about appearances, but because stubble reminded him of weeks when he hadn't known what day it was. His eyes were the sort that didn't look past people. They looked through rooms, through corners, measuring distance and exits without thinking. He rarely spoke unless there was a reason. Years of learning that words could turn into liabilities had taught him to spend them carefully. In the truck bed, braced against the cold with a composure that bordered on ceremonial, rode Sable. The German shepherd was older now, 8, maybe 9, black along the spine with tan legs and a face that had begun to silver around the muzzle. His ears still lifted sharply at small changes in sound, but his joints asked for an extra second when he shifted his weight. A black harness hugged his chest, worn soft at the straps. He wasn't a pet in the simple sense. He had once been a working dog with a job that saved lives, and he carried that identity the way some men carried medals, quietly, without asking to be noticed. His amber eyes tracked movement along the road edges, the flutter of a loose tarp, the flick of a crow's wing. He made no noise. He didn't need to. Cal passed rows of old duplexes and corner bars with fogged windows, then climbed toward the quieter border where the city thinned into pines and hard-packed dirt. The house waited at the end of a short drive that had been plowed once and then forgotten. It wasn't ruined in the cinematic way people imagined abandonment. It was worse than that. It was tired. Cedar siding grayed by years of wind, a porch railing that leaned just enough to make you notice. One window on the first floor boarded with plywood, another with a curtain hanging crooked like it had been tugged down in a hurry. The roofline sagged a fraction at the back corner, the kind of subtle damage that didn't scream, only counted down. Cal killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal. The silence inside the cab was not peaceful. It was the kind that asked questions. He didn't answer them. He reached for the worn envelope on the passenger seat, thick with official paper, and pushed it back under his glove like hiding it would change what it contained. Then he opened the door. Cold hit him like clean punishment. His boots sank into slush that couldn't decide whether it was ice or mud. Sable jumped down with practiced control, landing softly despite his size. He stood beside Cal, tail low and still, scanning the property in a slow sweep. Cal didn't tell him what to do. They moved together the way they always had, two bodies that understood each other without needing to prove it. The front door resisted, swollen from moisture. Cal leaned his shoulder into it and felt it give. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood and a faint sweetness like dried pine needles. The living room was small, almost disappointingly so, as if memory had enlarged it to justify the distance he'd kept. A couch with frayed arms slumped against the wall. A coffee table held ring stains like pale scars. The house wasn't empty of things, it was empty of presence. Cal set his bag down and did what he always did in unfamiliar spaces, checked corners, noted exits, listened for the wrong sound. Sable padded through the room with his nose low, not sniffing for fun, but reading scent the way Cal read posture. The dog paused at the baseboard, then moved on. In the kitchen, a sink held 2 rust-stained dishes. A towel hung on a hook, folded with sharp edges that made Cal's chest tighten before he understood why. The person who folded like that had wanted order to mean something. He told himself he was here for practical reasons. Clean out, list the property, sell it, leave Duluth behind the way he'd left so many places behind. But that plan had weight in his mind, neat, reasonable, unromantic. It would have held too if the first night hadn't arrived so quickly and so cold. By evening, the wind increased, pushing against the house with a steady insistence that made the siding creak like a tired joint. Cal dragged an old mattress into the living room and laid it near the dead fireplace. He ate standing up, a can of soup warmed on the stove, because sitting felt like settling and settling felt like surrender. Sable lay near the hallway, positioned so he could see both the front door and the back, his body stretched long but ready. Cal watched him for a moment and looked away. Sleep came in broken pieces. He woke to the house speaking in small noises, the pop of contracting wood, the rattle of a window that didn't seal, the whisper of snow against glass. At some point he became aware of Sable moving, nails clicking softly on the floorboards. Cal didn't sit up. He listened. The dog wasn't pacing. He was doing something deliberate. Then the movement stopped. Not a casual stop, a full-body decision. Sable stood at the door that led down to the basement, ears angled forward, tail held perfectly still. His head lowered to the seam beneath the door where the air leaked through. He inhaled once, twice. Then he lay down, slowly, carefully, as if making himself less of a threat. His gaze lifted to Cal. It was a signal Cal recognized from another life. Something living is here, not necessarily hostile. Not yet. Cal sat up, the old stiffness in his shoulder blade flaring as if to remind him that time had passed, even if memory hadn't. He reached for his flashlight. The beam cut across the living room, catching dust motes like drifting sparks. Cal stood barefoot on cold boards, then slipped into his boots without tying them fully. He didn't want to announce himself with laces and hesitation. He approached the basement door. The air near it was colder, as if the house exhaled through that crack. Sable stayed on the floor, head lifted, watching Cal's hands. Cal placed his palm on the knob. He could feel the faint vibration of the wind through the wood. But underneath it there was another sensation, a tightness in his chest that wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition, the awareness that a choice was approaching. He didn't open it. Cal stepped back, slow, controlled. He moved to the kitchen, took the heaviest chair, and wedged it under the basement doorknob, not as a barricade, not as a threat, but as a boundary. Daylight, he told himself, a clear head, a plan. Some things were better met when you could see your own hands. Sable rose and followed him to the mattress. He didn't press in for comfort. He simply lay down close enough that Cal could hear his breathing, steady, patient, refusing panic. Cal stared at the ceiling, at the faint stain where water had once leaked, and felt the plan he'd arrived with begin to loosen at the edges. He had come to sell a house. But in the first night back, the house had already asked him a question, and his dog, his old, reliable dog, had pointed to where the answer was hiding. Outside, Duluth's wind kept pushing, and the lake kept making its cold promises. Inside, Cal stayed awake longer than he meant to, understanding one thing with uncomfortable clarity. Leaving was going to be harder now, because something below the floor had made itself known, and Sable had refused to look away. Morning did not arrive so much as it seeped into the house, a thin, bluish light filtering through the crooked curtains and turning the dust in the air into something almost visible enough to count. Duluth's wind had not rested during the night. It had only changed direction, pressing now against the back of the house in steady pulses that made the siding mutter in low complaint. Cal Rourke woke on the mattress with the stiffness he expected, lower back tight, left shoulder blade knotted like a fist that never quite opened. For a few seconds he lay still, listening. The house spoke in its usual language, wood settling, a faint tick from the stove, the distant scrape of branches along the roof. But beneath that there was something else, not movement exactly. Presence. Sable was already awake. The German shepherd stood near the basement door, where Cal had wedged the chair, his weight balanced evenly, ears forward, breathing slow and controlled. Frost had formed along the inside edge of the window glass, and the dog's silhouette was cut into that pale morning light like a deliberate shape. When Cal swung his legs off the mattress, Sable glanced back once, not anxious, not urging, simply acknowledging that the next decision belonged to the man. Cal pulled on his boots and this time tied them fully. He moved without rushing, the way he had learned to do when adrenaline would only make things worse. The kitchen felt colder than the living room. He filled the kettle, struck a match, and set it over the burner. The small, ordinary ritual grounded him, the smell of gas, the faint click as flame caught, near the sound of water beginning to heat. He poured coffee grounds into an old tin filter and waited until the first thin ribbon of steam rose. Behind him, Sable did not leave his post. Cal drank half the mug standing at the counter, eyes on the basement door. He told himself again, daylight, clear head, plan. The logic held, but something beneath it, older than logic, kept a steady pressure behind his ribs. When he set the mug down, he didn't speak. He walked to the chair, lifted it away from the knob, and rested his palm briefly against the wood. The air leaking through the seam smelled faintly of damp earth and old lumber, and something warmer layered beneath it. Human. Cal opened the door slowly. The stairs descended at a shallow angle, boards worn smooth by years of use. Cold air moved upward, carrying a thin thread of scent that Sable immediately tracked. The dog did not push past Cal. He stepped forward one pace and then stopped, body aligned with the man's leg, a habit built from repetition. Cal clicked the flashlight on and let the beam sweep downward. The basement was not fully unfinished, half concrete, half packed dirt. A workbench lined one wall, tools hung in careful rows, their outlines marked in faded pencil where each had once belonged. "Hello," Cal said, voice low, pitched not to carry as a challenge. "I'm not here to start trouble." Silence answered. It was not empty silence, it had weight. Sable shifted his stance and then did something that made Cal's pulse slow despite himself. He lowered his body and lay down on the top step, head up, ears forward, a posture of watchfulness without threat. A faint rustle came from behind a stack of old storage crates near the far wall. The flashlight beam caught the edge of a boot, then the curve of a shoulder. A man stepped out first. He was tall but bent slightly at the waist. As if years of labor had pressed him forward by degrees, he no longer noticed. He looked to be in his early 60s. His face was deeply lined, the skin weathered the way wood darkens after decades of exposure. A beard, once dark, now mostly white, covered his jaw but had been trimmed with care. His hair, thin and gray, had been combed back despite the circumstances, suggesting a pride that had survived whatever else had been lost. He wore heavy canvas work pants patched at both knees and a faded flannel shirt buttoned to the throat. His hands were large, knuckles thickened by old fractures, on fingers stiff when he held them still. When he spoke, his voice carried the rough grain of the Great Lakes docks. "We'll go," he said immediately. "Didn't mean any harm, just needed a place dry." Behind him, another figure shifted. A girl stepped into view slowly, staying close enough that her sleeve brushed the man's elbow. She was small for her age, 10, maybe 11, thin in the way that suggested careful rationing rather than neglect. Her hair was a muted brown, pulled into a loose ponytail that had come undone overnight, strands falling across a pale face dusted with freckles. Her eyes were dark and alert, fixed on Cal with the kind of watchfulness children learned only when safety had become conditional. She wore an oversized winter coat whose sleeves extended past her wrists, the zipper pulled up unevenly. Indeed, the man angled his body slightly in front of her without making a show of it. Cal recognized the posture immediately. "What's your name?" Cal asked, keeping the flashlight angled toward the floor instead of their faces. "Vernon Pike," the man said after a moment. Most call me Vern. He hesitated, then added, "This is my granddaughter, Juniper." Juniper did not speak. Her gaze shifted, not to Cal, but to Sable. The German shepherd had not moved. He watched her with steady, unblinking calm. After a moment that stretched longer than it should have, Juniper took a cautious half-step forward. Her hand lifted, then stopped, hovering in uncertainty. Sable's ears flicked once, and he lowered his head slightly. Not submission, not invitation, simply removing height from the interaction. Juniper's fingers touched the thick fur along his neck. Her shoulders began to shake. She did not make a sound. The silent kind of crying, the kind learned when noise made situations worse, tightened something in Cal's chest that he had spent years training out of himself. Vern turned his face slightly away, jaw set hard enough that the muscle ticked. Cal exhaled slowly. "Nobody's leaving right now," he said. The words surprised him with how final they sounded. "It's warmer upstairs." Vern opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it. Pride fought visibly with exhaustion. Finally, he nodded once. The climb up the stairs was careful. Vern favored his left leg, each step measured. Cal noticed the subtle dip in the man's left shoulder, a compensation pattern that spoke of an old injury that had never healed correctly. Juniper stayed close behind Sable, one hand still resting lightly against his harness, as if he were the only stable object in the room. In the kitchen, the space felt smaller with more bodies in it, but less hollow. Cal set the kettle back on the stove and poured hot water into 3 mismatched mugs. He thinned the remaining soup with more water than he would have used alone and cut the last of the bread into even portions. They ate quietly. Vern spoke in short, practical sentences. He had worked most of his life loading and repairing equipment along the Duluth shipping yards until a rigging failure years back crushed part of his spine. The injury ended steady employment. Savings went to medical bills. Juniper's mother, his daughter, had died the previous winter after a long illness that left nothing behind but debt and a child who refused to be separated from the only family she had left. Shelters, Vern explained, had rules that made them choose different beds, different buildings. He had chosen movement instead. Juniper finished her soup and folded her hands in her lap, posture too careful for someone her age. Sable moved to sit beside her chair, close enough to be reassuring without crowding. Cal listened without interruption. "You can stay," he said finally. "Not forever. We'll figure next steps, but you can stay." Vern stared at the table for several seconds. "We won't be trouble." "Trouble's rarely loud," Cal replied. "Mostly it's expensive." The corner of Vern's mouth twitched, almost a smile. The afternoon passed with small adjustments. Vern fixed a loose hinge on the cabinet using a screwdriver he had found on the basement bench, movements slow but precise. Juniper sorted a stack of old envelopes Cal had left untouched, arranging them into neat piles. Sable shadowed her quietly. Outside, a county truck slowed on the road and then continued past. Cal noticed. That night, as darkness settled early over Duluth and the wind carried the promise of more snow, Cal lay back on the mattress again. The house sounded different now, less empty, more fragile. Across the room, Sable slept with one eye partially open, positioned so he could see both the hallway and the kitchen. Cal stared at the ceiling and understood something with uncomfortable clarity. Letting them stay had already changed the terms of why he was here. The third morning at the house began before the light fully committed to the sky. Duluth carried a different kind of cold that day, less violent than the night winds, but heavier, as if the air itself had thickened with moisture, waiting to turn into snow. Cal Rourke woke to the sound of something unfamiliar layered into the house's usual language of settling wood and distant traffic. It took him a few seconds to identify it, the soft scrape of a chair leg across the kitchen floor, followed by the careful clink of ceramic against metal. He did not reach for the knife he kept within arm's reach out of habit. He listened. Sable was already awake. The German shepherd lay near the hallway, his body stretched along the threshold between rooms, head lifted. His eyes tracked movement beyond the corner, but his posture held no tension. And that alone told Cal more than any sound. Cal sat up slowly. The stiffness in his back had settled deeper after another night on the thin mattress, but pain registered now as information rather than complaint. He pulled on his boots, tied them without looking down, and stepped into the kitchen. Vern Pike sat at the table, shoulders slightly hunched forward, both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he had clearly poured himself. In daylight, the details of the older man's condition were easier to read. The left shoulder dipped lower than the right, the spine subtly curved in compensation for the old injury he had mentioned. A faint tremor moved through his fingers when he held the mug still, the kind that came from long-term nerve damage rather than age alone. His beard, though mostly white, had been trimmed again, someone who had little left but refused to surrender dignity. "I didn't want to wake you," Vern said, voice rough but steady. "Kettle was already there." Cal nodded once. "You sleep?" Vern gave a short exhale that might have been humor. "I've slept worse." Juniper appeared in the doorway a moment later, wrapped in the oversized coat, her hair still loose from sleep. She paused when she saw Cal, her gaze flicking instinctively to the nearest exit before settling on Sable. Only after the dog lifted his head and met her eyes did her shoulders ease enough for her to step fully into the room. Breakfast was sparse, oatmeal stretched thin with extra water, bread rationed carefully. Cal noticed how Vern waited until Juniper finished before touching his own bowl. Juniper, in turn, slowed her eating as if trying to make the food last through will alone. Outside, the sky hung low and gray. After they ate, Cal pulled on his jacket and reached for the keys hanging by the door. "I've got some work lined up," he said, not as reassurance, but as fact. "Fence repair down near Rice's Point. Pays cash." Vern straightened slightly. "I can help." Cal shook his head before the older man could push himself up. "Not today." The silence that followed wasn't offended. It was understanding. Vern's back wouldn't survive a full day in frozen ground, and both men knew it. Sable followed Cal outside, stepping carefully down the porch stairs, pausing a fraction longer than he once would have before landing. Age showed itself in those brief hesitations. Cal noticed. He always did. He didn't comment. The job near the harbor took longer than promised. The fence posts were rotted deeper below the frost line than they appeared, and the ground fought every attempt to set anything straight. By the time Cal finished, his gloves were damp and his shoulders burned with the familiar ache of overuse. The man who paid him introduced himself as Harlan Voss, a broad-shouldered rancher in his early 50s with a face permanently reddened by wind exposure. His beard grew thick and uneven, more gray than brown, and his hands were scarred across the knuckles from years of manual work. He spoke little, but his eyes were direct and without calculation. "Not many stick with a job this long in this weather," Harlan said as he counted out the bills. Cal shrugged. "Work's work." Harlan hesitated, then added a carton of eggs from the back of his truck. "Take these too." Cal accepted without argument. Pride didn't keep anyone warm. By the time he returned to the house, the light had shifted toward afternoon. The place felt different again, less abandoned, more occupied in a way that carried both comfort and risk. Inside, Vern had managed to fix the cabinet hinge completely. The repair was clean, screws aligned, the movement of the door smooth despite the tremor that now ran visibly through his hands when he rested them on the table. Juniper sat with a stack of old envelopes and manuals Cal had never sorted. She had organized them into neat labeled piles using a dull pencil she must have found in a drawer. Her handwriting was small and precise. Sable lay at her feet, head resting on one paw, eyes tracking the room with quiet vigilance. The electricity flickered twice, and Cal looked toward the breaker panel automatically. The wiring was older than he liked, cloth insulation in places that should have been replaced years ago. Another problem. The mail arrived late that afternoon, delivered by a county truck that slowed just enough to be noticed. Cal stepped outside, boots crunching over a thin crust of snow. Inside the mailbox sat a single envelope, white, official, stiff. He did not open it immediately. He brought it inside, set it on the table, and finished checking the breaker first. Delay would not change what the paper contained, but routine gave him a moment to choose how to react. When he finally opened it, the notice was brief. Overdue property taxes, timeline, consequences outlined without malice or sympathy. Cal read it twice, then folded it carefully. Gus, no. Vern watched from across the room. "Bad news?" he asked quietly. Not new, Cal replied. Just louder. Evening settled early. Snow began to melt into freezing rain that tapped against the patched section of roof. Within minutes, a slow drip returned near the kitchen. Cal placed a pot beneath it. Each drop struck metal with a steady, patient rhythm. Vern moved toward the back room earlier than the night before, fatigue pulling at his posture. Juniper curled on the couch with one of the old manuals open, though her eyes didn't track the page. Sable positioned himself near her feet. Cal stood by the window, looking out toward the road. Headlights passed once, slow enough to suggest someone observing. He filed it away. Later, when the house had quieted, Vern returned to the kitchen. He held his hat in both hands, but turning it slowly. "We won't stay long," he said. "I can see what this is doing to you." Cal met his gaze. Pride and fear sat side by side in the older man's expression. "We'll take it one step at a time," Cal said. It wasn't reassurance, it was the only promise he could make. That night, Sable did not sleep deeply. His breathing remained steady, but one ear stayed angled toward the front of the house. Cal lay awake longer than he meant to, listening to the drip, the wind, and the subtle shift of a place that had stopped being empty. He had come here to sell. Now there were bills he couldn't ignore, repairs he couldn't afford, and two lives occupying space that had already begun to feel less temporary. Staying, he realized, was no longer a single decision. It was becoming a series of costs. By the fourth morning, the house had begun to hold warmth in small, reluctant pockets. Near the stove, along the stretch of floor where sunlight managed to slip past the crooked curtain, at the kitchen table where 3 mugs now rested instead of 1. Outside, Duluth carried a flat, iron-colored sky that threatened more snow without the courtesy of falling yet. The air had that waiting quality common to the lake in late winter, as if weather were a decision still under negotiation. Cal Rourke stood at the counter with a wrench in hand, coaxing the last bit of life from a drawer that had decided overnight it would no longer open without protest. His movements were economical, the result of long practice. No wasted force, no unnecessary noise. Across the room, Juniper Pike sat on the floor with Sable's broad head resting against her knee, her fingers absent-mindedly combing through the coarse fur at the dog's neck. The German shepherd, now clearly showing the silver that had spread along his muzzle, accepted the contact with patient stillness. He did not lean into her, but he did not withdraw. His amber eyes tracked the front window, ears making small adjustments at distant sounds most people would miss. Vern Pike occupied the chair nearest the stove, back straight, despite the discomfort that radiated through his spine in the mornings. He had shaved more closely than the day before, beard trimmed to a short, even line that revealed the angular structure of his jaw, evidence that once, before injury and hardship, he had likely been a man who carried himself with physical confidence. His flannel shirt was buttoned carefully, sleeves rolled just enough to free his wrists. He held a pencil over a scrap of paper, attempting to list what tools still functioned in the basement. The quiet broke with the sound of tires slowing on gravel. It was subtle, more a change in pitch than volume, but both Cal and Sable reacted at the same moment. Cal set the wrench down. Sable rose without haste, body aligning beside Cal's leg as he had countless times before. No barking, no display, just presence. Through the front window, a dark SUV had stopped near the sagging fence line. It looked out of place on the narrow, rutted drive, too clean, too recently washed for roads that had been mud and salt for weeks. The driver's door opened. The woman who stepped out moved with practiced efficiency, placing each heel carefully on the uneven ground. She was in her early 40s, tall and slender. Even wearing a charcoal wool coat cut with sharp lines that suggested she valued function over comfort. Her dark hair was drawn into a low knot at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place despite the wind. Her skin held a pale undertone that contrasted with sharply defined cheekbones. Her eyes, gray, perhaps blue depending on the light, did not linger without purpose. This was someone accustomed to rooms where decisions were made quietly and consequences arrived later. Cal opened the door before she reached the porch. She stopped at the bottom step, assessing the house, the yard, and finally Cal himself. Her gaze flicked briefly to Sable, noting the harness, the posture, the stillness. "Caleb Rourke," she said, not asking. "Who's asking?" "Sloan Wexler." She extended a hand, grip firm, brief, professional. I work in land acquisitions across St. Louis County. Cal wiped his palm on his jeans before shaking it. Her hand was cool. What do you need? He asked. Sloane's eyes moved past him, cataloging details. The repaired hinge, the extra pair of boots near the door, the faint movement of Juniper behind the kitchen table. She did not comment immediately. This property has been flagged, she said evenly. Deferred maintenance, back taxes, potential zoning complications. Cal waited. I make it a habit, she continued, to approach owners before circumstances narrow their options. Meaning? I'm prepared to purchase the house as is. I assume the tax burden, handle paperwork, you walk away clean. Her tone remained neutral, almost sympathetic, the kind of sympathy that cost nothing. And the people inside? Cal asked. Chief Sloane tilted her head slightly. That, she said, is part of the complication I'm offering to remove. Behind Cal, the floorboard creaked. Vern had stepped into view, hat in hand, shoulders squared more from resolve than strength. Juniper stood half-hidden behind him, one hand resting against Sable's flank. Sable moved forward one deliberate step, placing himself between Sloane's line of sight and the interior of the house. He did not bare teeth, he did not growl. He simply existed, solid and unignorable. Sloane's gaze lingered on him for a fraction longer. Military dog? Yes. Figures. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of lake ice across the yard. I think you should consider my offer carefully, Sloane said. The county has procedures. Anonymous reports tend to surface when properties fall out of alignment. The implication settled without being spoken outright. Cal's jaw tightened. Not interested. For the first time, something in Sloane's expression changed, not irritation, but recalculation. My card, she said, placing it on the porch rail. You don't strike me as a man who enjoys surprises. She turned and walked back to the SUV, closing the door with controlled precision. The engine idled only long enough for her to check something on the dashboard before she drove away without spinning gravel. The yard felt larger after she left. Inside, Vern exhaled slowly. We should go, he said. This isn't your fight. Cal shook his head once. Not today. The statement carried no argument. Late afternoon brought the second interruption. A county truck pulled into the drive, followed by a smaller sedan marked with municipal decals. Two men stepped out. The first, Harold Bennett, was in his late 50s, thin to the point of fragility, with graying hair combed meticulously across a scalp that had begun to surrender territory. His wire-frame glasses slipped down his nose when he spoke, and he pushed them back with nervous habit. He wore a county-issued jacket zipped fully despite the mild temperature, posture suggesting a man who believed deeply in procedure because procedure had once protected him from something personal he no longer discussed. The second man introduced himself as Evan Cole, land use inspector. He was younger, mid-30s, broad, shouldered with a square jaw shadowed by close stubble. His movements were measured, efficient. A faded scar ran along the underside of his chin, half hidden by the collar of his jacket. His eyes did not linger unnecessarily. They catalogued. Routine inspection, Evan said. We received a report. Cal nodded once. Of course you did. They walked the property together. Evan photographed the sagging roofline, the exposed wiring junction near the porch, the leaning section of fence. Harold scribbled notes with increasing speed as the list grew. Inside, Vern stood near the table, hat still in hand, face composed. Juniper remained seated with Sable at her side. The dog's posture was relaxed but alert, tracking the unfamiliar men without moving. Evan spoke plainly. Requirements, timelines, potential penalties. No threat in his tone, just fact. Compliance would require repairs Cal did not yet have the funds to complete. When they finished, Harold lingered near the edge of the yard. I know this is difficult, he said quietly, but we have to follow procedure. So do I, Cal replied. The truck and sedan left in a slow procession. Silence filled the space they vacated. Vern stepped closer, voice lower now. I've lived long enough to know when I'm the weight tipping the scale. Juniper's fingers tightened in Sable's fur. We're not leaving today, Cal said, more firmly than before. Evening came with freezing rain that tapped against the roof in a steady rhythm. Another envelope waited in the mailbox, thin this time, but no less official. Cal read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it with the others on the kitchen table. Later, after Juniper had fallen asleep on the couch and Vern had retreated to the back room, Cal sat alone, and the stack of notices spread before him. Sable lay at his feet, breathing deep and even. Outside, the barn-shaped shadow of the neighboring tree line stretched across the yard. Pressure had arrived without shouting, ink, signatures, timing. Cal understood now that staying would not be a single act of kindness, it would be endurance. The decision did not announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, folded into the gray light of early morning, the kind that dulled edges and made every object in the house look temporarily unfinished. Cal Rourke found the note on the kitchen table beside the stack of county envelopes, its torn spiral edge catching against his fingers before he even read the first line. The handwriting was careful but uneven, letters pressed harder toward the end as if the writer's hand had begun to shake. Cal, we'll be gone before noon. You've already done more than enough. Vern. For a moment Cal did not move. The kettle on the stove clicked softly as metal cooled, a sound that felt too ordinary for what had just shifted. The couch across the room was empty. The blanket folded with a precision that suggested intention rather than habit. The house had regained space, but it did not feel lighter. Sable stood near the back hallway, posture alert but not tense. His ears angled toward the rear door, then back to Cal. He had known before the note was found. Cal stepped toward the hallway. Vern Pike stood near the mudroom, canvas bag resting against his leg. He had dressed fully, flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, coat zipped, boots laced tight. In the pale light, his face looked older than it had the night before. The white in his beard seemed brighter, the lines around his mouth carved deeper by the effort of holding something steady that wanted to break. Juniper stood several feet behind him, backpack straps clenched in both fists. Her oversized coat swallowed her shoulders. Now she had managed to zip it halfway before her hands began to tremble too badly to finish. Sable moved past Cal and settled beside her, pressing his shoulder lightly against her leg. His presence was deliberate, grounding. "You don't have to do this," Cal said, voice even. Vern shook his head once. "I do." He bent slightly to lift the bag. Pain crossed his face before he masked it, jaw tightening. "County's watching. That woman, Wexler, she didn't come here for conversation." Juniper made a small sound, barely a word, and then crossed the distance between them in 2 quick steps, wrapping her arms around Vern's waist. The restraint she had maintained for days broke all at once. Her shoulders shook violently. "Please," she said into his coat. Vern closed his eyes, his large, scarred hand resting on the back of her head. "No, safe means moving," he murmured. Cal took a step forward, then stopped. He recognized the posture in Vern, the kind of decision that hardened if pushed. By mid-morning, they were gone. Cal stood on the porch as Vern walked down the drive, uneven steps steady through sheer will. The canvas bag hung from one shoulder. Vern did not look back. Pride would not allow it. The cold carried the sound of gravel under worn boots long after the figures had turned the corner. Inside, the silence pressed harder than before. Juniper's absence left a shape on the couch that felt visible even without her there. Sable moved to the front window, sitting with his back straight, eyes tracking the empty road. Cal attempted to work. He tightened the loose board near the porch, checked the breaker again, measured the sag in the roofline from the yard. None of it held his focus. By afternoon, the wind had shifted again, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. Without fully deciding to, Cal found himself walking toward the basement. The air inside was colder than the main floor, the smell of old wood and damp concrete familiar now. Light from the single window cut a narrow beam across the far wall, the section Sable had reacted to on the first night. The boards there were darker, older, reinforced in a way that did not match the rest of the structure. Sable entered behind him and sat abruptly, eyes fixed on the seam between 2 planks. Cal knelt. He ran his fingers along the wood, feeling the subtle difference where years of dust had failed to fill a narrow gap. He knocked lightly. The sound that returned was wrong, hollow. His father's voice surfaced in memory, not words, but instinct. Hide important things where they belong, not where they're obvious. Cal did not open it. Not yet. He stood slowly, resting his forehead against the wood for a moment, breathing in the cold, the hay-sweet scent of old storage. If something had been placed there deliberately, it had waited this long. It could wait a little longer. Night fell early. The house creaked as temperature dropped, each board contracting with small, sharp sounds. Cal sat at the kitchen table, the stack of envelopes spread before him. Property taxes, compliance timelines, repair estimates scribbled on scrap paper. He pressed his palms flat against the wood. For the first time since returning, doubt pressed hard enough to break through habit. Had staying been responsibility or stubbornness? Sable crossed the room and rested his head against Cal's knee. The dog's breathing was slow, steady, warm through denim. Cal's hand moved automatically into the thick fur at his neck. Outside, a truck passed on the road, headlights cutting briefly across the ceiling. Life moving on, indifferent. Sleep came in fragments. When morning arrived, it did so with a hard blue sky that followed the storm's edge. Frost glazed the yard. The air burned clean in his lungs. Cal rose before dawn and poured coffee he barely tasted. The couch remained empty. The blanket stayed folded. Sable waited by the door, already alert. Cal grabbed a flashlight without consciously deciding why. The barn behind the house had been little more than a shape in his peripheral vision for days, a structure leaning slightly, paint long gone to raw wood. Now, drawn by something he could not name, he crossed the yard. The hinges groaned when he pulled the door open. Inside, cold held tight. Dust drifted through narrow beams of sunlight slipping between warped boards. The smell of old hay layered with rusted metal. Cal walked directly to the far wall. Up close, the difference was undeniable. The boards were older than the rest of the barn interior, set with nails that had been driven with deliberate spacing. Sable sat beside him, tail resting on packed dirt, posture upright despite stiffness in his hips. Cal traced the seam. A nail head sat lower than the others. He worked it free carefully, using the flat edge of his multi-tool. The wood gave with a soft crack, releasing a breath of air that smelled sealed and old. Behind the panel lay a narrow cavity beneath the barn floor. Inside rested a metal box wrapped in yellowed oilcloth. Cal lifted it out, setting it on the dirt. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition that whatever lay inside would change the shape of everything that followed. He did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he rewrapped the cloth loosely and replaced the panel with care, setting the board back into place as if nothing had been disturbed. Some things, he understood, required the right moment to face. When he stepped back into the yard, the morning sun had climbed just enough to cast long shadows toward the house. Sable followed at his side. The space Vern and Juniper had left behind still held weight, but now it was joined by something else. Possibility. Cal did not open the box until late afternoon, not because curiosity had weakened, but because discipline had held. The morning passed in the kind of practical motion that kept his hands occupied while his mind arranged itself around the weight of what he had found. He cleared a section of the kitchen table, wiped it down with a damp cloth that smelled faintly of old detergent, and stacked the county notices into a single, aligned pile as if order on the surface could contain the pressure beneath it. Outside, Duluth sky had settled into a pale, unforgiving blue that followed the night's cold front, the kind that made every sound travel farther than expected. Sable moved through the house with his usual quiet patrol, pausing at the front window, then the hallway. Then returning to sit near the table where Cal had placed the oilcloth-wrapped metal box. The German shepherd's age showed more clearly in daylight. The black saddle along his back had dulled into charcoal, and the tan at his legs carried faint flecks of gray. When he lowered himself onto the floor, he did so carefully, hindquarters folding with a measured patience that had replaced the quick precision of his younger years. His eyes, however, remained bright and attentive, tracking Cal's hands as they moved toward the box. Cal sat down across from him. The oilcloth crinkled softly as he unwrapped it. The metal beneath was dull with oxidation, corners rubbed smooth by time, but otherwise intact. A simple latch, no lock. He paused with his fingers resting against it. Then he lifted the lid. Inside lay several bundles of cash secured with faded twine, the bills older, edges softened but still usable. Beneath them rested a stack of papers wrapped in waxed paper that had yellowed to the color of weak tea. The smell that rose was not mold. It was sealed time, dry and preserved. Cal set the money aside without counting it. He unfolded the top sheet. The handwriting was unfamiliar at first glance, rounded, deliberate, each letter spaced with care that suggested someone who believed clarity mattered. The signature at the bottom stopped him. Orson Rourke, his uncle. Cal remembered him only in fragments, a tall man with a quiet voice, a mechanic's hands that smelled faintly of oil even at the dinner table, a habit of fixing things without announcing he had done so. Orson had never married. Deere had never seemed interested in explaining his choices. The letter began simply. "If you're reading this, you stayed longer than you planned." Cal exhaled through his nose. The pages that followed were not dramatic confessions. They were records, dates written in neat columns, names, some crossed out, some followed by short notes. 3 nights, found work. Truck repaired. Left supplies. Interspersed among them were paragraphs written in a second hand, firmer, more angular. His father's. Grant Rourke had never been a man for sentiment. His handwriting pressed hard into paper as if each word cost something to produce. The notes were brief but unmistakable. Good with tools. Keep him through the storm. Doesn't talk much. Leave him be. Cal sat back slowly. The house, this house, had not been abandoned between occupants. It had been used, not as a shelter in the official sense, but as something quieter. A place where people could stop without paperwork. Another sheet lay beneath, written entirely in Orson's hand. "This place isn't meant to make anyone comfortable for long," it read. "It's meant to give them enough time to stand up again." Cal's throat tightened. Sable shifted closer, resting his chin lightly against Cal's knee. Beneath the papers lay a second envelope, thicker. Inside were receipts for repairs spanning nearly 2 decades, roof patches, wiring updates, furnace parts, all paid in cash. Dates aligned with winters Cal now realized had been harsher than average. Orson had maintained the property deliberately. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately, was a final note. "The money isn't for keeping the land. It's for keeping the door possible." Cal closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the words settle. He counted the bundles then, not out of greed, but necessity. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to change timelines, enough to cover the overdue taxes, at least the immediate ones. Outside, a vehicle slowed on the road. Sable's head lifted instantly. Cal replaced the papers in careful order, leaving the money out. The truck that pulled into the drive was older, a county service pickup with rust creeping along the wheel wells. The man who stepped out moved with the cautious stiffness of someone whose joints had argued with him for years. He introduced himself at the porch as Martin Hale, utilities technician. He appeared to be in his late 40s, tall but slightly stooped, and with sandy hair thinning at the crown and a beard grown more from neglect than style. His face carried a permanent crease between the brows, a look formed by years of delivering inconvenient news to people who rarely welcomed him. "Got a notice about irregular draw on the line," Martin said, adjusting his gloves. His voice held a Midwestern patience that bordered on apology. Cal let him inside. Martin inspected the breaker panel with practiced efficiency, fingers moving with familiarity despite the cold. He explained that the old wiring likely caused intermittent surges that triggered automated reports. "No shut-off today," he added, "but you'll want it updated." His gaze flicked briefly to the repaired cabinet hinge, then the neatly stacked papers. "You doing the work yourself?" "Some," Martin nodded once. "That helps." He left a small card with contact information for a licensed electrician willing to work on older structures. No pressure, just procedure. After he left, the house settled again. Cal moved the money into a canvas pouch and placed it inside his jacket. The next stop came without hesitation. The courthouse in town smelled of paper and old coffee, fluorescent lights humming overhead. At the counter sat a clerk named Marianne Holt, a woman in her late 40s with tightly pulled back auburn hair and reading glasses perched low on her nose. Her posture suggested long hours spent behind the same desk, shoulders squared more from routine than comfort. Cal slid the payment across. Marianne processed the figures, fingers tapping the keyboard in steady rhythm. When the balance cleared, her brows lifted slightly. "Not many folks settle this without a dispute," she said. "I've argued enough," Cal replied, the receipt printed with a mechanical whir. By late afternoon, he had scheduled a roofer. The man who arrived to assess the damage was Caleb Voss, older brother to Harlan. Broader through the chest, beard fuller and streaked with iron gray, Caleb carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades solving problems with his hands rather than his voice. He spoke little, measured the sagging section, and quoted a price that was fair without being charitable. Work would start the next morning. When Cal returned home, dusk had begun to settle. The repaired receipt sat on the table beside the remaining envelopes. For the first time since arriving, one of the pressures had lifted. Sable met him at the door, detail giving a single restrained thump. Cal placed the box back beneath the floor panel in the barn later that evening, restoring the wood exactly as he had found it. Some things were not meant to be displayed. They were meant to be carried forward. Standing in the yard afterward, the air colder but clearer, Cal understood something with a certainty that did not require words. The house had not been left to him as an asset. It had been left as a responsibility. The next morning began with the sound of boots on the roof and the steady scrape of a shovel pushing aside the last crust of ice that had refused to melt. Caleb Voss worked without ceremony, his broad frame outlined against a sky that had turned the color of worn steel. From the yard, Cal Rourke could hear the methodical rhythm of metal against shingles, lift, clear, check, repeated with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that rushing only made problems return. Caleb Voss, older brother to Harlan, moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent most of his life balanced on uneven surfaces. He was in his early 50s, thick through the shoulders, with a beard grown full and square along the jaw, iron gray threading through what had once been dark brown. A faint ridge of scar tissue ran from the corner of his left ear down into his collar, an old fall from a ladder he had mentioned the day before, delivered without drama. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried the dry steadiness of a man accustomed to being heard once. "Decking's soft in 2 spots," he called down without looking. "We'll sister the joists. Won't be pretty, but it'll hold." "Hold is fine," Cal replied. Inside the house, the change in sound had already begun to shift the atmosphere. The persistent drip in the kitchen had stopped overnight, replaced by the heavier thud of boots above. Sable lay near the doorway, ears adjusting to each movement. The German shepherd's coat caught the morning light in muted bands of black and tan. The silver along his muzzle was unmistakable now. Beady, but his eyes tracked every unfamiliar noise with undiminished focus. By mid-morning, the wind had picked up again, carrying the smell of wet pine from the tree line. Cal stepped outside with a thermos of coffee and passed it up the ladder without comment. Caleb accepted it with a single nod, hands still gloved. Work continued. The first interruption came just past noon. A pickup turned into the drive. Older, engine knocking faintly as it idled. The man behind the wheel cut the engine and sat for a moment before opening the door, as if gathering himself. Cal recognized the posture before the face. Vern Pike stepped down carefully, one hand braced against the doorframe. The road had taken something from him in the short time he'd been gone. The lines around his mouth had deepened. Yes, and the stiffness in his left leg had worsened enough that each step required visible concentration. His beard had grown out unevenly, white catching the light in rough edges. On the passenger side, Juniper emerged. The oversized coat still hung from her shoulders, but her ponytail had been retied. Her face looked thinner, eyes shadowed by a night without proper rest. She scanned the yard automatically, then locked onto Sable. The German shepherd rose. His tail moved once, a restrained acknowledgement. Juniper crossed the space in 3 quick steps and dropped to her knees, arms wrapping around the dog's neck. Sable accepted the contact with quiet dignity, shifting his weight to remain steady under her grip. Cal met Vern halfway. "You didn't have to come back," Vern said, voice rough. "I did," Cal replied. Vern searched his face, looking for signs of obligation, of debt. Whatever he found there eased something in his shoulders. "We didn't make it past the church lot," Vern admitted. "Truck wouldn't start this morning." Juniper remained pressed against Sable, breathing evening out. "You're not staying in the truck," Cal said. It was not framed as generosity. It was a decision already made. Inside, the house felt less fragile than it had days earlier. The repaired section of roof held. The air was warmer, the light less filtered by gaps that had since been sealed. Vern removed his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. "We'll work," he said. "Whatever you need done." Cal nodded once. "There are rules." Vern's posture straightened despite the pain. "No hiding. Short stays unless paperwork's in motion. If you can work, you do." "That's fair," Vern said. Juniper moved to the table, eyes following the neat stack of documents. The afternoon passed with quiet motion. Vern sorted the remaining usable tools in the basement, movement slow but precise. Juniper wiped down the kitchen counters, each pass of the cloth careful. Outside, Caleb Voss finished securing the final patch section and descended the ladder. "It'll hold through thaw," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Cal paid him the agreed amount. Caleb pocketed the cash without counting it, a sign of trust earned more from consistency than conversation. His gaze flicked briefly toward Vern and Juniper inside the doorway. "House looks less empty," he observed. "Yeah." Caleb nodded once and left. Late afternoon brought another visitor. A county sedan rolled up the drive. Stopping short of the porch, Evan Cole stepped out first, clipboard in hand, coat zipped high against the wind. His square jaw was shadowed with fresh stubble, and his eyes moved across the property with the same methodical assessment as before. Harold Bennett followed, adjusting his glasses as he approached. "We're here to confirm progress," Evan said. Cal stepped aside to let them see. They walked through the house, the repaired roofline, the stabilized wiring junction, the organized documentation on the table. Vern stood near the wall, hat in hand, but posture steady. Juniper remained seated with Sable beside her, fingers resting lightly in his fur. Evan took photographs. Harold scribbled notes more slowly this time. "This addresses several immediate concerns," Evan said finally. There will still be a community review regarding occupancy." Cal nodded. "Understood. No argument, no resistance. Procedure met with compliance." As they left, Harold paused. "Not many properties recover this quickly," he said quietly. "Sometimes they're waiting for someone to stay," Cal replied. Evening settled without rain for the first time in days. The house held warmth longer after the stove died down. Footsteps sounded solid against the floor instead of hollow. At the table, Cal outlined the next steps: permits, inspections, documentation. Vern listened without interruption. Juniper leaned against Sable, no longer watching the exits every few seconds. Outside, the sky cleared enough for a faint line of stars to appear above the dark silhouette of the tree line. Cal stood on the porch for a moment before turning in. The pressure had not disappeared. It had changed shape. Now it required consistency. The morning of the review arrived without ceremony, the kind of gray dawn that seemed less like the start of a day and more like a continuation of the night that refused to fully release its hold. Duluth's air carried a thin edge of thaw, just enough warmth to soften the snow along the fence posts into a brittle crust that broke underfoot. Cal Rourke stood at the kitchen counter with a mug he had already forgotten to drink from, reading the printed notice one more time. The community review would be held that evening at the Lakeside Grange Hall, a building older than most of the zoning language that now governed places like his. Sable waited by the front door, posture upright despite the stiffness that had settled deeper into his hips over the past week. The German shepherd's coat, once sharply contrasted black and tan, now showed its age in muted tones, but his gaze remained fixed on the drive as if expecting movement before it occurred. When Cal set the mug down, the dog rose without prompting and fell into step beside him. Vern Pike had been awake longer than either of them. He sat at the table with a clipboard balanced carefully across his knees, reviewing the documentation Cal had assembled: repair receipts, the cleared tax statement, the electrician's scheduled work order. In daylight, the tremor in Vern's hands was visible but controlled, each page turned with deliberate precision. He had shaved again, beard trimmed close enough to reveal the squared line of his jaw. Pain still shaped his posture, but purpose had given him a steadiness that fatigue alone could not. Juniper stood at the sink, rinsing the last of the breakfast bowls. Her movements were quieter than necessary, but not tentative. She had begun to occupy the space without constantly mapping escape routes. Every few seconds, her fingers brushed Sable's shoulder as he passed, an unconscious habit now that the dog had become part of her sense of safety. "You don't have to come," Cal said to Vern without looking up. Vern shook his head once. "I do." The answer held no defensiveness, only resolve. The drive into town took longer than usual. Snowmelt had turned side streets into uneven tracks that forced Cal to keep the truck slow. The Grange Hall came into view at the edge of the neighborhood. A long, low structure painted white decades ago, now weathered into a shade that matched the sky. Its windows held the faint haze of old glass. Oh, and the wooden steps had been replaced more than once with boards that never quite matched. Inside, the air smelled faintly of floor polish and old coffee. People had already begun to gather, farmers in heavy jackets, retirees who carried themselves with the quiet authority of having attended more meetings than they could count, a handful of younger residents drawn by curiosity. Conversations remained low, respectful of the space's long habit of hosting disputes that were rarely personal but always consequential. At the front of the room stood Arthur Bell, the board chair. He was in his early 60s, tall and narrow, with a long face and thinning silver hair combed carefully to one side. His posture carried the patience of someone who had spent decades guiding discussions toward outcomes that satisfied no one completely, but offended the fewest. His hands rested lightly on the edge of the podium, fingers long, knuckles prominent. He acknowledged Cal with a brief nod. Sloane Wexler entered last. Her coat was a different shade than before, deep navy rather than charcoal, but cut with the same precise tailoring. Her dark hair remained secured at the nape of her neck, and the sharpness of her features seemed softened only by the fluorescent light overhead. She moved through the room without haste, greeting Arthur with a professional handshake that held no warmth but no hostility either. When her eyes met Cal's, the acknowledgement was brief, recognition without invitation. Cal took a seat near the front. Vern lowered himself carefully into the chair beside him, breath controlled through the movement. Juniper sat on Vern's other side, hands folded in her lap. Sable lay at her feet, body stretched along the aisle, head up, ears tracking each shift in tone across the room. Arthur called the meeting to order. His voice carried evenly without amplification. "We are here to review the current use and compliance status of the Rourke property." Sloane spoke first. She did not raise her voice. Her presentation was concise, supported by printed documents that she distributed with practiced efficiency. She outlined deferred maintenance history, liability concerns, the precedent that informal occupancy could create. Her tone never suggested accusation, only risk. "Good intentions," she concluded, do not eliminate structural responsibility." Cal listened without interruption. When Arthur invited response, Cal stood. He did not bring notes. "This place isn't a business," he said. "It's not a shelter either. People stop there long enough to get back on their feet. There are rules. Work if you can. Move on when you're ready." A murmur moved through the room. Not agreement yet, but attention. Before Sloane could respond, a man near the back rose. He introduced himself as Daniel Cross. Daniel appeared to be in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders despite a slight hitch in his left arm that suggested an old injury. His beard had gone unevenly gray, trimmed short along the jaw. His eyes carried the quiet fatigue of someone who had known long stretches without stable work. "I stayed there last winter," Daniel said. 3 weeks. Truck broke down. He fixed it. Didn't charge me, just had me clear brush." His voice steadied as he continued. "I left with a job." Another voice followed. Ruth Keller, a retired nurse with close-cropped white hair and posture, still upright from years of long shifts, stood from the second row. "His uncle helped my sister years back," she said. "No paperwork, just time." One by one, others spoke. Short statements, no embellishment. Sloane listened, expression unchanged but eyes more focused now, recalculating. Arthur allowed the room to settle before speaking. "It appears," he said carefully, "that the property has served a function not fully captured in prior reports." Discussion followed. Conditions proposed, documentation requirements outlined, occupancy limits clarified. Cal accepted each without argument. This transparency, he understood, was the price of legitimacy. The final decision was not framed as approval or denial. It was permission, conditional, monitored. The meeting adjourned without applause. Outside, the night air carried a sharper cold than expected. Vern released a breath he had been holding since the first testimony. Juniper knelt briefly to hug Sable, her laughter, quick, surprised, cutting through the tension. Sloane approached them near the steps. Up close, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes were more visible. "You won't get rich doing this," she said. "I know." She studied him for a moment longer. "Then, keep it documented." "I will." She nodded once and turned away. The drive back felt shorter. At the house, the porch light cast a steady circle across the thawing yard. The repaired roof no longer leaked, or the interior held warmth longer. Inside, Cal placed the meeting packet beside the earlier documents. Sable settled near the doorway, breathing slow. Vern moved to the back room without being asked. Juniper lingered at the table, tracing the edge of the paper with one finger. Cal stood for a moment in the quiet. The pressure had not vanished. It had changed into something that required consistency instead of defense. This story was never only about a house, a piece of land, or even a man who came home carrying more weight than anyone could see. It is about the quiet ways God often works, rarely through thunder or sudden fortune, but through small, faithful choices made when no one is watching. Sometimes the miracle is not that everything is fixed at once, but that a weary heart is given the strength to stay, to care, and to open a door that could have remained closed. In our daily lives, we may also face moments where leaving feels easier than kindness, where protecting ourselves seems safer than helping someone who has nowhere else to go. Yet, it is often in those ordinary decisions, sharing what little we have, offering time instead of judgment, that broken places begin to heal. God's grace does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks beside us quietly, like a loyal companion, guiding us toward what is right when we feel most alone. If this story reminded you that hope can still grow in difficult places, consider sharing it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of this journey spoke to your heart, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories that bring light where there has been darkness. May God bless you and your family, protect your path, and give you peace where there is worry, strength where there is exhaustion, and courage to choose compassion even when it costs something. Wherever you are watching from tonight, may His presence walk with you and remind you that no life is ever truly forgotten.